When I listen to how this dispute has unfolded, I can't shake the sense that it was almost destined to turn into a direct clash of narratives rather than a straightforward discussion of facts. On one side stands Jacob Frey, a mayor who has spent years navigating the fault lines between federal authority and local trust, especially in a city where those lines are already painfully visible. On the other is Kristi Noem, speaking from the vantage point of national security and institutional defense, where cohesion and confidence are treated as strategic assets. Neither appears to be speaking casually, and neither seems inclined to soften their language for the sake of harmony. The result is a confrontation that feels less like a policy disagreement and more like a referendum on whose version of reality carries weight. From Frey's perspective, the issue begins with narrative control rather than legal nuance. He has openly challenged how federal authorities describe the shooting, suggesting that the official explanation does not line up cleanly with what available video appears to show. That claim alone is enough to unsettle a city that has learned, through bitter experience, how damaging mismatches between footage and official statements can be. Frey's language doesn't read as cautious deference, it reads as frustration with what he sees as premature certainty. By calling the federal account misleading, he invites residents to question not just the conclusion, but the process that produced it. There's an emotional subtext to that challenge that's hard to ignore. Minneapolis carries a long memory when it comes to law enforcement encounters and the aftermath of contested explanations. For a mayor, credibility with the public is inseparable from the perception that he is willing to confront higher authority when local trust is at stake. Frey seems to be operating from the belief that silence would be interpreted as complicity or resignation. In that light, his insistence on transparency becomes as much political survival as moral stance. Noem's response emerges from an entirely different institutional reflex. As head of DHS, her priority is to defend the legitimacy and judgment of federal officers operating under her department's umbrella. From that vantage point, public doubt cast by a local official can look like an erosion of confidence that extends far beyond one incident. She has framed the shooting as an act of self-defense, emphasizing perceived threat rather than contested detail. That framing is designed to reassure not just the public, but the agents who rely on institutional backing to do their jobs. The contradiction between these two positions is stark. Frey questions whether the explanation matches observable evidence, while Noem asserts that the explanation itself is the evidence that should anchor interpretation. One asks the public to look again. The other asks the public to trust the system already in place. Neither explicitly accuses the other of bad faith, yet the implications feel pointed. When those implications collide, neutrality becomes almost impossible. What complicates matters further is the role of video, which has become the most volatile form of evidence in modern politics. Video promises clarity, but often delivers ambiguity, especially when filtered through expectation and prior belief. Frey's insistence that officials are ignoring what the footage shows implies that truth is being selectively interpreted. Noem's defense suggests that the footage is either incomplete or insufficient to override trained judgment. The public is left navigating between those interpretations without a clear referee. This is where the dispute takes on its broader significance. It's not only about what happened in one encounter, but about who gets to define reality when federal and local authorities disagree. Frey's stance resonates with those who believe accountability begins with skepticism toward centralized explanations. Noem's stance resonates with those who fear that constant questioning undermines law enforcement's ability to function. Both instincts are rooted in genuine concerns, which makes the clash feel unavoidable. I find myself wondering whether either side fully appreciates how much the other is constrained by role. A mayor cannot easily defer when residents demand answers that feel immediate and personal. A DHS secretary cannot easily concede doubt without risking the morale and authority of federal forces nationwide. Each is performing a function shaped by expectation rather than pure preference. Yet performance still has consequences when it hardens into posture. The language Frey uses carries a moral urgency that is clearly aimed at his city. By calling the federal explanation divisive, he signals that words themselves can reopen wounds. That accusation isn't about legality, it's about social impact and collective memory. For residents who already distrust federal involvement, Frey's critique sounds like validation. For federal officials, it sounds like a challenge to legitimacy. Noem's language, by contrast, is structured around stability. She speaks of self-defense and operational necessity, concepts that imply order rather than error. In doing so, she shifts the focus away from what might be ambiguous toward what she portrays as unavoidable. That rhetorical move is common in national security discourse, where uncertainty is treated as a vulnerability. But in a city primed to interrogate authority, that same move can feel dismissive. The tension escalates because each statement reinforces the other's skepticism. Frey's push for transparency makes Noem's defense appear rigid. Noem's defense makes Frey's demands appear accusatory. Neither side needs to exaggerate for the conflict to deepen. It feeds on contrast alone. There's also an unmistakable political dimension that lingers beneath the surface. Local leaders often frame federal intervention as heavy-handed, especially in communities sensitive to outside control. Federal leaders often frame local criticism as parochial or politically motivated. Those frames don't require proof to take hold. They rely on familiarity. Once activated, they shape how every subsequent detail is received. I can't help but notice how quickly the conversation moved from specifics to symbolism. The shooting became a proxy for debates about immigration enforcement, federal presence, and local autonomy. Frey's criticism reads as part of a broader argument that local communities deserve more say in how federal power is exercised within their borders. Noem's rebuttal reads as part of a broader argument that national policy cannot bend to local pressure without losing coherence. The original facts risk being buried beneath those larger themes. This raises an uncomfortable question about resolution. If the dispute is really about narrative authority, what outcome would actually satisfy either side? Transparency alone may not restore trust if interpretations remain polarized. Institutional defense alone may not calm communities that feel unheard. The stalemate seems baked into the structure of the debate. There's also the question of timing, which often amplifies conflict even when intentions are steady. Moments of heightened public sensitivity make every statement feel heavier. Frey's critique might have landed differently in a calmer climate. Noem's defense might have been less contentious under different circumstances. Context, as always, shapes reaction more than content. What stands out to me is how both figures appeal to responsibility, but define it differently. Frey frames responsibility as responsiveness to local perception and lived experience. Noem frames responsibility as loyalty to institutional judgment and procedural consistency. Neither definition is frivolous, and neither is complete on its own. The friction arises because they overlap without aligning. The public, meanwhile, is asked to choose which version of responsibility feels more convincing. Do they side with the leader who challenges power in the name of transparency, or with the leader who defends authority in the name of order? That choice is less about facts than about values, and values rarely change through evidence alone. I also find myself thinking about how this confrontation will age. Short-term outrage often fades, but reputational impressions linger. Frey may be remembered as a mayor who pushed back when others stayed quiet. Noem may be remembered as a secretary who held the line against criticism. Those narratives will persist even if new information complicates them. The danger in that persistence is simplification. Complex events become shorthand for broader political identities. Nuance gets flattened into slogans and sound bites. That flattening serves political mobilization, but not understanding. Yet it's difficult to resist once the confrontation has been framed. What complicates the picture further is the absence of a universally trusted arbiter. Federal investigations move slowly, and local confidence erodes quickly. By the time conclusions are reached, public opinion may already be settled. Frey's call for transparency acknowledges that impatience. Noem's defense implicitly resists letting impatience dictate judgment. Neither approach guarantees legitimacy. Transparency without consensus can inflame disagreement. Authority without trust can deepen alienation. The space between those outcomes is narrow and unstable. This dispute seems to occupy that space precisely. As I watch the exchange, I'm struck by how much it relies on tone rather than evidence. Frey's tone conveys urgency and skepticism. Noem's conveys firmness and reassurance. Listeners respond to tone instinctively, often before processing content. That instinctive reaction may matter more than any later clarification. There's also a subtle irony at play. Both leaders claim to be protecting public confidence, yet their clash risks undermining it. Each statement invites counterstatement. Each defense invites further doubt. The spiral continues even without escalation. I find myself asking whether this was ever avoidable. Given the city's history and the federal government's posture, perhaps not. Certain moments seem structurally primed for confrontation. This appears to be one of them. The question becomes how much damage the confrontation does before it resolves. Ultimately, this standoff between Frey and Noem feels like a mirror held up to the broader American debate about power and trust. Local versus federal, skepticism versus deference, transparency versus stability. These tensions are not new, but they are sharper now. The shooting became a catalyst, not the cause. The arguments surrounding it reveal fractures that were already there. Whether those fractures widen or slowly close will depend less on who wins the argument and more on how each side responds to uncertainty. If Frey continues to press for openness, he risks being accused of politicizing tragedy. If Noem continues to defend without qualification, she risks appearing indifferent to doubt. Both risks are real, and both leaders seem aware of them. Awareness, however, does not eliminate consequence. In the end, what lingers is not a clear answer, but a series of unresolved questions. Did the official explanation adequately reflect what occurred? Does challenging that explanation strengthen accountability or weaken trust? Can federal authority coexist with local skepticism without turning adversarial? Those questions remain open, and perhaps that openness is the most honest outcome of all. As the debate stretches on, what becomes clearer is how much of it now lives in implication rather than evidence. Neither Frey nor Noem appears eager to push the dispute into a definitive arena, where one version must formally defeat the other. Instead, each seems content, at least for now, to let their respective audiences draw conclusions that feel emotionally coherent. That choice is understandable, but it also locks the conflict into a prolonged phase of interpretation. Interpretation, once unleashed, is notoriously hard to rein back in. Frey's continued emphasis on transparency reads like an attempt to anchor the conversation in observable reality. By returning again and again to video and first-hand accounts, he implicitly argues that truth should be accessible, not abstract. That position aligns neatly with a public that has learned to distrust summaries offered without raw material. At the same time, it places Frey in the role of translator between local experience and federal explanation. Translators, however, are often blamed when meaning doesn't carry cleanly across boundaries. Noem's persistence in defending the federal account reflects a different calculation. She appears to be betting that institutional continuity will outlast local outrage. From her vantage point, conceding ambiguity publicly may invite further challenges elsewhere. Federal authority, once seen as negotiable, can quickly become fragmented. Her stance suggests that unity of message is itself a form of stability. That difference in strategy keeps the dispute alive, even when new information is scarce. Every pause becomes an opportunity for speculation. Every reiteration hardens positions rather than clarifying them. The longer this continues, the more the original incident risks being overshadowed by the meta-conflict around it. At that point, resolution becomes symbolic rather than factual. I find it revealing how often both sides invoke the public, yet seem to imagine different publics entirely. Frey appears to be speaking primarily to residents who want acknowledgement of doubt and complexity. Noem appears to be speaking to a national audience that expects decisiveness and institutional confidence. Those audiences overlap, but they are not identical. Messages calibrated for one can alienate the other. This misalignment is where much of the friction resides. Frey's skepticism may reassure locals while unsettling those who fear erosion of federal authority. Noem's firmness may reassure supporters of enforcement while deepening local suspicion. Neither effect is accidental, even if neither is fully intended. Politics often works through these secondary consequences. There's also the question of endurance. Local outrage can be intense but fleeting, while federal institutions are built to outlast cycles of anger. Noem may be relying on that asymmetry, assuming time will blunt criticism. Frey, by contrast, operates on a shorter clock, where unresolved doubt can quickly turn into electoral liability. That difference in time horizon shapes how urgently each speaks. As days turn into weeks, the discourse subtly shifts. Initial reactions give way to analysis, and analysis gives way to narrative. Once narrative solidifies, facts become supporting characters rather than drivers. People stop asking what happened and start arguing about what it means. That transition marks a point of no return in public controversy. At that stage, even new evidence may struggle to reset the conversation. Evidence doesn't land in a vacuum. It lands in a story already being told. Frey's insistence on further scrutiny may then be seen as persistence or provocation, depending on the listener. Noem's consistency may be seen as steadiness or stubbornness, again depending on perspective. Meaning becomes relational rather than objective. What troubles me most is how easily both positions can be caricatured. Frey risks being reduced to a mayor reflexively opposing federal power. Noem risks being reduced to a secretary reflexively defending enforcement. Those reductions ignore the complexity of their actual arguments, but simplification is the currency of prolonged political conflict. Once simplification sets in, incentives change. Compromise looks like weakness. Nuance looks like backtracking. Silence looks like guilt. Every move becomes performative, whether intended or not. That performative pressure can distort decision-making. Leaders begin speaking not to resolve, but to maintain alignment with their base. The original goal of clarity recedes, replaced by the goal of consistency. Consistency, however, is not the same as accuracy, yet it is often rewarded more reliably. I keep coming back to the role of trust because it underpins every aspect of this clash. Frey is effectively saying trust must be earned through openness. Noem is effectively saying trust must be preserved through confidence. These are not mutually exclusive ideals, but they are being treated as such here. The conflict persists because no mechanism exists to reconcile them. The absence of such a mechanism is not accidental. The American system assumes friction between levels of authority. It expects tension between local accountability and federal uniformity. What it does not provide is a clear script for moments when that tension becomes publicly adversarial. In those moments, personalities fill the gap. Personalities, in turn, attract scrutiny. Every prior statement by Frey is re-examined for consistency. Every prior stance by Noem is reinterpreted for motive. Neither can fully control how their histories are used against them. The present dispute recontextualizes the past. That recontextualization feeds a broader cynicism that is difficult to contain. If leaders cannot agree on what they see, how can the public be expected to agree on what to believe? This question lingers even among those who sympathize strongly with one side. It undermines confidence not just in individuals, but in the process itself. And once process feels unreliable, outcomes lose legitimacy. At some point, the practical necessity of moving forward will assert itself. Investigations will continue or conclude. Statements will taper off. Attention will drift to the next controversy. But drift is not the same as closure. Unresolved tensions tend to resurface later, often in altered form. The Frey-Noem clash may echo in future disputes over federal presence in local jurisdictions. It may shape how quickly local leaders speak out, or how cautiously federal officials frame responses. Its legacy will be diffuse rather than dramatic. Yet, diffuse influence can be more enduring than headline-grabbing moments. As an observer, I'm left less with conviction than with unease. Unease about how quickly narratives harden when trust is already thin. Unease about how little room there is for provisional judgment. Unease about how often leaders are forced to choose between candor and cohesion. These are not comfortable reflections, but they feel unavoidable here. In that sense, the confrontation tells us as much about the political environment as it does about the incident itself. It reveals a system struggling to reconcile transparency with authority. It exposes the costs of misalignment between local and federal expectations, and it underscores how easily tragedy becomes terrain for ideological struggle. Those dynamics are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. If there is a lesson embedded in this ongoing exchange, it may be a modest one. Words matter not only for what they assert, but for how they resonate with collective memory. Confidence reassures until it collides with doubt. Skepticism empowers until it breeds fragmentation. Navigating between them requires more than principle. It requires humility. Whether humility will emerge from this standoff remains uncertain. Both Frey and Noem appear firmly rooted in their respective interpretations of responsibility. Neither has shown signs of retreat, and perhaps retreat is not the point. The point may simply be to endure the tension without letting it rupture something larger. If that is the goal, then the silence between statements may matter more than the statements themselves. As the silence lengthens, it begins to speak in its own way. Not the silence of resolution, but the silence of calculation, where each side waits to see how the ground settles before taking another step. In that space, public attention becomes a variable rather than a constant. The intensity softens, but the memory does not disappear. It lingers, ready to be reactivated by the next related spark. Frey's position increasingly looks like one shaped by proximity. He is physically and politically closer to the community, absorbing the shock of the incident. That closeness makes abstraction difficult, perhaps impossible. When people stop him on the street, they are not asking about doctrine or jurisdiction. They are asking whether what they saw with their own eyes is being taken seriously. That kind of question leaves little room for bureaucratic patience. A mayor who responds with procedural language risks sounding detached. Frey seems acutely aware of that risk, and it shows in how he frames his comments. He speaks less like an official issuing findings and more like a witness urging caution. Whether that framing is effective or inflammatory depends entirely on who is listening. Noem's distance, by contrast, is structural rather than personal. She operates at a level where individual cases blur into categories. Her responsibility is not only to one city, but to a nationwide system that relies on predictability. From that height, conceding doubt in one case can look like inviting doubt everywhere. That perspective rewards firmness, even when firmness frustrates local demands. The clash between proximity and distance is one of the oldest tensions in governance. Local leaders feel the heat first and most intensely. National leaders feel it later, but across a broader surface. Each develops instincts that make sense in their own context. Problems arise when those instincts collide without a mediating buffer. I keep wondering whether both sides are underestimating how their words are being repurposed. Statements meant for reassurance become ammunition in online debates. Cautious phrasing gets clipped into certainty. Context evaporates the moment it meets virality. Neither Frey nor Noem can fully control that transformation. Once transformed, the dispute takes on a life independent of its originators. Commentators assign motives neither side explicitly stated. Allies exaggerate intent to strengthen their case. Critics do the same to undermine it. The original nuance dissolves into something more rigid and more combustible. At that point, even restraint can be misread. Frey's pauses may be seen as strategic silence rather than careful consideration. Noem's lack of elaboration may be seen as avoidance rather than confidence. The interpretive gap widens with every passing day. Bridging it becomes increasingly difficult without a dramatic intervention. Yet dramatic intervention carries its own risks. A forceful federal statement could escalate local distrust. A more aggressive local challenge could harden federal resistance. Both sides appear to understand that escalation might satisfy partisans while damaging institutions. That shared understanding may be the only thing keeping the conflict contained. Contained, however, does not mean resolved. It means the disagreement is being managed rather than answered. Management buys time, but not clarity. Over time, the lack of clarity becomes its own source of tension. People begin to suspect that ambiguity is intentional. Suspicion thrives where explanation thins out. Residents ask why answers take so long. Supporters of enforcement ask why doubt is being amplified. Each group fills the gaps with assumptions that reinforce existing beliefs. Dialogue gives way to parallel monologues. In that environment, leadership becomes a balancing act bordering on contradiction. Speak too plainly, and you risk oversimplifying. Speak too carefully, and you risk sounding evasive. Frey and Noem are walking that line from opposite directions. Neither can afford to fall off. What's striking is how little space there is for provisional truth. The idea that an explanation might evolve is treated with suspicion. People want finality, even when circumstances resist it. That impatience pressures leaders to sound more certain than they may feel. Certainty becomes performative rather than descriptive. This performative certainty is where long-term damage can quietly accrue. Once leaders commit to a fixed narrative, retreat looks like admission. Adapting to new information becomes politically costly. The system rewards staying the course, even if the course narrows options. Flexibility, ironically, becomes a liability. I can't help but think about how this moment will be referenced later, not as a case study of facts, but as an example of friction. Future debates will echo phrases used here, even if circumstances differ. The Kristi Noem exchange may become shorthand for a type of standoff. That shorthand will simplify what was, in reality, deeply layered. Layered conflicts are hard to explain, but easy to exploit. They offer enough ambiguity for multiple narratives to coexist. They allow audiences to select the version that fits their worldview. They resist closure precisely because they satisfy too many interpretations. This dispute fits that pattern almost perfectly. What worries me most is how normalized this kind of stalemate has become. Disagreement without resolution no longer feels exceptional. It feels routine, even expected. That normalization dulls urgency but deepens fatigue. People grow accustomed to living with unanswered questions. Fatigue, in turn, lowers expectations. Citizens stop demanding coherence and settle for alignment. They ask not whether something is true, but whether it's consistent with their side. That shift is subtle, but consequential. It changes the incentives leaders face. Frey's insistence on questioning may then be rewarded not for its substance, but for its symbolism. Noem's insistence on defense may be rewarded for the same reason. Symbolic victories replace substantive ones. The actual circumstances recede further into the background. The conflict becomes self-sustaining. At some point, the only thing that will truly change the dynamic is time. Time dulls edges and rearranges priorities. New events crowd out old ones, but time does not erase precedent. It merely embeds it quietly. When the next similar incident occurs, memories of this one will resurface. Leaders will recall how quickly narratives hardened. They will recall which words inflamed and which restrained. They may adjust accordingly, or they may repeat the pattern. Institutional learning is uneven at best. For now, the standoff remains suspended, not frozen, but slowly drifting. Each statement nudges it slightly without tipping it. Each silence stretches it without breaking it. That suspended state is uncomfortable, but perhaps intentional. In the absence of a clear ending, meaning accumulates indirectly, through tone, timing, and repetition, through what is emphasized and what is left unsaid, through which questions are answered and which are deferred. The audience pieces together its own conclusion, and that, perhaps, is the most consequential aspect of all. The conclusion is no longer delivered from a podium. It is assembled in the minds of those watching. Frey and Noem influence that assembly, but they do not control it. Once public interpretation takes hold, it becomes its own actor. Whether that actor moves toward understanding or deeper division remains uncertain. What is certain is that this confrontation has exposed how fragile shared reality can be. When authority fragments, narratives compete. When narratives compete, trust becomes conditional. And when trust becomes conditional, every future dispute starts at a disadvantage. As that disadvantage settles in, it reshapes expectations in subtle ways that are hard to measure, but easy to feel. People begin listening less for explanation and more for alignment, less for detail and more for reassurance. Statements are evaluated not on whether they illuminate, but on whether they confirm a prior sense of who is trustworthy. That shift doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the default. By the time anyone notices, it already feels normal. In that environment, Frey's continued questioning starts to function as a signal rather than an inquiry. To some, it signals courage and attentiveness. To others, it signals defiance or even opportunism. The content of what he says matters less than the role he appears to be playing. Once a role is assigned, everything is filtered through it. Noem experiences the same narrowing effect from the opposite direction. Her defense of federal action becomes less about the specifics of this case and more about defending the idea of federal authority itself. Supporters hear steadiness and resolve. Critics hear inflexibility and dismissal. Again, interpretation overwhelms intent. What gets lost in that process is the possibility that both perspectives contain legitimate concerns. It becomes harder to say that transparency and institutional confidence are not mutually exclusive. Harder to acknowledge that questioning does not automatically equal condemnation. Harder to accept that defending an institution does not necessarily mean ignoring uncertainty. Those nuances struggle to survive prolonged polarization. I notice how rarely anyone now asks what an ideal resolution would even look like. Is it a joint statement, an independent review, a fuller release of information, or is it simply time, letting intensity fade until the issue becomes historical rather than immediate? The lack of a shared endpoint makes every step feel provisional. Without an endpoint, frustration feeds itself. This is where governance begins to feel performative, even when it isn't meant to be. Leaders speak because silence would be interpreted, not because speech will resolve anything. They clarify because ambiguity would be weaponized, not because clarity is achievable. Every move is reactive, shaped by anticipated reaction. That feedback loop is exhausting, but difficult to exit. For residents watching from the ground level, that exhaustion is palpable. They hear competing accounts and feel asked to choose sides in a debate they did not initiate. They sense that their lived experience is being translated into language that serves broader agendas. That translation gap breeds resentment regardless of which side one favors. Resentment, once seeded, rarely stays contained. From the federal perspective, there is an equally deep fatigue. Officials grow weary of local criticism that seems to discount procedural rigor. They feel their expertise and training are reduced to slogans. That sense of being misunderstood hardens defenses. Defensiveness then reads as aloofness, completing the cycle. The tragedy is that this cycle benefits almost no one in the long run. Trust erodes incrementally on all sides. Each clash leaves behind residue that makes the next one harder to manage. Institutions spend more energy protecting posture than solving problems. Communities grow more skeptical of explanations before they are even offered. Yet, despite all this, the system continues to function, at least outwardly. Operations proceed, statements are issued, responsibilities are carried out. That functionality can be mistaken for health. But health implies resilience paired with repair. Repair is what feels most uncertain here. Repair would require acknowledgement without capitulation. It would require explanation without condescension. It would require patience from a public conditioned to immediacy. None of those conditions are easy to meet simultaneously. So repair is postponed, not rejected, but deferred. As the dispute gradually recedes from headlines, it leaves behind an altered baseline. Future statements will be heard against the echo of this one. Future disagreements will be quicker to escalate because the memory of escalation already exists. Leaders will speak knowing that doubt travels faster than reassurance. That awareness changes tone even when content remains similar. In the end, the most lasting impact of this confrontation may not be what anyone intended to prove. It may simply be the reminder that authority, once questioned, must adapt rather than insist. And that skepticism, once awakened, does not disappear just because attention moves on. The space between Frey and Noem remains, not as an open wound, but as a scar. Scars don't hurt forever, but they change how you move. By the time this episode finally loosens its grip on the public conversation, it does so without ceremony. There is no single moment when everyone agrees it is over. No clear signal that the tension has resolved. Instead, attention drifts elsewhere, pulled by newer controversies and fresher outrage. What remains is not closure, but residue. And residue has a way of shaping what comes next. Frey and Noem will both move on to other battles, other statements, other headlines. Their roles demand it, and politics rarely allows long pauses for reflection. Yet the memory of this confrontation will linger in how their words are received going forward. Each future comment will be filtered through what people believe they learned here. That filter, once in place, is hard to remove. For some, Frey will remain the figure who questioned when silence felt easier. For others, Noem will remain the figure who held the line when doubt threatened cohesion. Neither image is complete, but both are durable. Durability, in politics, often matters more than accuracy. Narratives survive not because they are perfect, but because they are useful. What this moment ultimately exposes is how fragile shared understanding has become. Not fragile because people lack information, but because they no longer agree on how to weigh it. Authority and skepticism now exist in a permanent standoff, each suspicious of the other. That standoff doesn't collapse institutions overnight. It slowly changes how much faith people place in them. The unsettling part is that no one appears fully satisfied by how this unfolded. Those demanding transparency feel it was incomplete. Those defending federal authority feel it was unfairly questioned. Even neutral observers are left with a sense of imbalance. When dissatisfaction is universal, something structural is usually at work. Perhaps the most honest takeaway is that this was never going to end cleanly. The forces involved are too large, the expectations too misaligned. Local trust and federal authority are not designed to overlap seamlessly. They coexist through constant friction, not perfect harmony. This dispute simply made that friction visible. In that sense, the ending is less about resolution and more about recognition. Recognition that confidence cannot be commanded, only maintained. Recognition that questioning does not automatically equal disloyalty. Recognition that silence can reassure some while alarming others. These contradictions are not bugs in the system. They are features. As the conversation fades, what matters most is not who persuaded whom. It is whether future leaders remember the cost of letting narratives harden unchecked. Whether they leave room for uncertainty without surrendering responsibility. Whether they resist the temptation to simplify what is inherently complex. Those choices will determine whether this moment becomes precedent or warning. So the story closes not with an answer, but with a recalibration. A subtle shift in how authority speaks and how doubt listens. A reminder that power, once questioned, must communicate differently to endure. And a quiet acknowledgement that trust, once strained, rarely snaps back to where it was. That may be the truest ending this kind of confrontation can offer.